arms, bring them home.
Bring them home, bring them home, bring our brothers, our sisters home. Welcome to Peace Now. My name is Trudy Quaife. I'm a member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. I'm your host today, and joining me are Jeanne Finley and Steve Downs. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hi, Trudy. Thank you for having us on.
I'm glad you're here. I want to tell you a little bit about Jeanne and Steve. Jeanne is a writer and an editor. She's one of the original members of the Muslim Solidarity Committee, which was formed in 2006 after the convictions of Albany Muslims Yassin Aref and Mohammed Hussein in a fictional FBI sting operation. The committee, the Muslim Solidarity Committee, advocates for these men and for their families. Jeanne joined Project SALAM at its founding in 2010. Project SALAM, based in Albany, advocates nationally for Muslims who have been preemptively prosecuted by the U.S. government. Jeanne is also president of the Capital Region chapter of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, a nationwide coalition of 20 advocacy and civil rights groups that focuses on preemptive prosecution, profiling, and prisoner abuse. Jeanne edited Yassin Aref's memoir titled Son of Mountains and Dr. Shamshad Hamad's account of the Aref Hussein case titled Rounded Up, Artificial Terrorists and Muslim Entrapment After 9/11. Steve Downs was in the Peace Corps in India. He was the chief attorney for the New York State Commission on Judicial Conduct. After he retired, he was part of the Yassin Aref defense team and later was a member of the Muslim Solidarity Committee and Project SALAM, defending Muslims against preemptive prosecution. He's now the executive director of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, which is taking Project SALAM's work to a national audience. Today, our topic is preemptive prosecution of Muslims by the U.S. government. So I think we need to start out by defining just what preemptive prosecution is. Steve, could you do that for us and explain to us why we should be concerned about this?
Right. After 9/11, the U.S. government was charged, or the FBI was charged with preventing another terrorist attack. And the problem that they were presented with was, how do you stop an attack unless you know who's going to do it? And so what the government did was it focused on ideology. It said, the theory was that ideology would in some ways predict who would commit crimes in the future. And so if you could find somebody who raised security concerns and you could find a way to preemptively put them in jail on pretext charges, manufactured charges, then you would get rid of any problem about possible terrorist attacks. And so they began a campaign of doing exactly that, of identifying people that they thought raised security concerns and then bringing charges against these people based on manufactured charges or manipulated factual records. And Yassin's case was one of those, Yassin Aref case. Mm-hmm. After, there really are three ways that this happens. One is that they passed a series of laws called material support for terrorism laws that essentially criminalize a lot of things that we all accept as normal. Mm-hmm. It criminalized things like donation to charitable organizations, or free speech, or free association, or peacemaking even, or social hospitality. All of these things, people have gone to jail for exercising those kinds of things. So that was one way that they could preemptively prosecute somebody whose ideology they distrusted. Another way was to assign an agent provocateur to try to talk somebody into a manufactured crime. And that was the case in Yassin's case and a lot of others. And there have been literally hundreds of these cases all over the United States.
All right, well, I'm interested in why both of you chose this particular issue to focus your activism on. I wonder if you could both answer that. Jeanne?
I got into this as a direct result of the convictions of Yassin Aref and Mohammed Hussein in October 2006 in Albany. The case certainly was page one of the newspapers here for as long as the trial lasted and well before. I was following it very closely, had been an activist working with peace groups against the start and the continuation of the Iraq War. But when this case came into the news and the convictions happened, it was such a shock, I think, not only to me certainly, but to many other activists as well, that we formed an ad hoc group, which later became the Muslim Solidarity Committee, to do two things: to advocate for the men, but also to advocate for their families. That's the other end of preemptive prosecution and all the erosion of civil liberties that is going on as a result of this. We don't see the families, and we knew that, and we wanted to be able to work equally as effectively with the families and help them in whatever they needed, as well as with the men.
Steve, how about you?
Well, I, of course, got involved with it through Yassine Arif. He was my client. We became very good friends. I believed that the government had deliberately prosecuted and convicted an innocent man, so I became very much emotionally involved in writing what I perceived to be this injustice. But then as I went around the country, I began to run into more and more groups all over the country supporting people who felt equally passionate about their own folks. Rafil Dafir out in Syracuse, an oncologist who the government preemptively prosecuted. Or Fahad Hashmi down in New York City. He was charged with storing a bag of clothes for a friend for 1 week. And that was enough because eventually the clothes made their way to the Taliban, and so he was accused of material support for terrorism. In Dafir's case, the only thing he did was he ran a charity to support starving children in Iraq. And that was basically what got him preemptively prosecuted. So as you became aware of these people, and more, you became more and more involved in this large community of people that were saying, what has happened to America? What has happened to our values? What's become of this country that we used to love? And so these are things I think that kept me going. Eventually, I should say, after we formed Project SALAM, we got a call from the Alarian family down in Washington. Sammy Alarian had been prosecuted simply for exercising his right of free speech to say, stand up for the Palestinians. And the government went after him and failed. They was not able to convict him. But they kept him in jail. He's been in jail for 9 years. And he's never been prosecuted, never been convicted of anything yet. So anyway, the Alarian family called us down there and said, it's time to form a national organization to do something about this. And that's how the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms was formed. It now includes some 20 mainstream organizations all over the country. And we now have several hundred families that we're working with who I correspond with on a regular basis. So it's a big community of people.
Okay, how about the other two organizations, the Muslim Solidarity Committee and Project SALAM? Why did you form those, and how are they different?
The Muslim Solidarity Committee was formed directly as a result of the convictions of Yassine Aref and Mohammed Hussein. And for a great while, the group of activists and community members, 50, 60, 75 people, including many members of the Muslim community and the mosque, where Yassine had been imam, was focusing specifically on the case. There were appeals, there was the sentencing, there was, all the things that were coming up. After the appeals, unfortunately, were denied, Yassine was sent to Communications Management Unit, which is, there are two in the country. These are special Muslim prisons, colloquially known as little gitmos, located in the Midwest, which have extensive and draconian restrictions on all communications, including family visits. We worked on that. We tried to get information out to the public. But we began to realize, as Steve said so well, that in doing the work around Aref Hussein and the two men and their families, that there were hundreds of other cases like this throughout the country, different and yet terribly the same. We began to communicate with the support groups and the families, and in 2010, Project SALAM was formed, which stands for Support and Legal Advocacy for Muslims.
Which Jeanne thought up, by the way.
Good name.
And SALAM means peace, so right there it's embedded.
Perfect.
That peace is and nonviolence certainly is part of our operating principle. We began to communicate with families and support groups and prisoners all over the country and to advocate for them. Project SALAM has a very active website, which evidently is seen all over the country and all over the world. And it was formed with a coalition of 2 or 3 other organizations, one based in Syracuse, the Dr. DeFeer Support Committee, a few in New York, the Faisal Hashmi Support Committee. So people all over wanted to become part of this, to advocate. Again, the families are the missing invisible element to all of these prosecutions. The plight of the families of these prisoners is unbelievable. Their fathers, brothers, sons, cousins have been taken away from them in an enormous barrage of national publicity and calumny, put in prison, sometimes for life. What are these families to do? Of course, the families are now headed mostly by women. And so suddenly we begin to see a whole subgroup of people, which is very similar to, you know, plight of single family, you know, single mothers, single head of household people throughout the country. And yet there's the element of shame and secrecy, because how can they say the T word? My husband is in prison because he's a terrorist. It isn't true. 99% of the time, 99.9% of the time that their husbands are terrorists. This is where the preemptive prosecution aspect really comes into play for people who are not versed in the law or rights. Many of these are immigrant families who are here legally on green cards, but they're coming from another culture entirely. We can't say your husband's been preemptively prosecuted. All they know is that their husband is in prison and they want them out. And so they need a whole kind of side aspect of support. So Project SALAM advocates not only for these prisoners, but also for their families throughout the country.
Well,
and perhaps I could just add that the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms has picked up on the kind of agenda that Project SALAM had. When we founded it, it's 20 organizations. Project SALAM is one of those 20 organizations, but it is following essentially the same kind of program we have. And they're focused, well, largely because it's made up of families of people who have been preemptively prosecuted. So they understand the problem. One of the things that the National Coalition recently did was it had a family conference in which it got together the families of a large number of people who had been preemptively prosecuted to talk about their common problems. And it was very touching, I have to say. They brought a lot of the teenagers, the women down, who talked about this experience of being shunned by their own community because they were labeled as terrorists, the poverty, they had no money to do things, the humiliation that they'd endured just trying to get jobs or trying to otherwise survive. And as they talked, we had a sense of what we wanted to be able to get them to do was to move beyond this sense of victimhood that had been put upon them, to be empowered to talk about what has happened to them and what has happened to them as a result of the collapse of civil rights in the country. Later we had some of the people wrote back and said that this was one of the most wonderful things that had ever happened this weekend, because for the first time they were no longer alone. They had people who were supporting them. And we're going to do it again this May. We're going to get them all back together again and have a conversation.
Good. Could you talk a little bit more about the local families that you've worked with?
Yes. There actually were 3 cases in Albany. There was the Aref Hossein case, which I've spoken a little bit about. Around that time, perhaps a little bit later, a case involving a primary family member who lives in Albany but was prosecuted in New York City, and that is the Tariq Shah. They call it the martial arts case because a lot of the parameters, it was again a sting, a false setup to lure a victim into participating in something that he otherwise would not have participated in, namely terrorism. It involved martial arts, so they call it the martial arts case. As I said, the family member lives in Albany, and we did make a very, very strong connection with her. There was also the case right here in Del Mar of Imam Umar. That was not a terrorism case, but it was a case of incredible harassment, complete removal of his civil rights. We did get involved there as well in advocating certainly for him and for his families. The families of all of these men and cases are still in Albany. It has been certainly both a challenge to help them because they have very special needs, and it has been emotionally very difficult because, of course, we don't believe that these men belong in prison any more than they believe the men belong in prison. And so having to work forward with that reality in front of us is hard enough, but to see the suffering of the wives and particularly the children without their father in the house, without hope of seeing their father, husband, son for X number of years, we can't do anything about that. We are trying. But of course you're fighting the law enforcement system in this country, which has operated under the paradigm of preemptive prosecution now since 9/11, and it's very strong. There are very committed activists, advocates throughout the country who are doing amazing, very positive, strong things. It's a challenge with the families. They have the biggest challenge of all.
I was just going to add that, particularly in the case of Yassine Araf, his family, he had a wife and 4 children, and they did not drive. They have no way to get out there, and she has no source of income. So when he was put into one of these special, mostly Muslim prisons in the Midwest, the communication management units, we would try to make at least once a year to go out there to visit him, and it required essentially 5 days. You had to rent a big van and go out there for 5 days. You'd 2 days out, 1 day at the prison, 2 days back. So it turned into a major kind of family event, which was both extremely painful because they could not talk. They were not allowed contact. They could only talk to each other through a plate glass window and on the telephone. And for young children to have to go through that, of course, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it raised a lot of interesting things. I remember, for example, the kids loved to go to a motel because they'd never been to a motel before, and there was a swimming pool there. And over the years that we did this in a number of times so that eventually the kids learned how to swim by jumping into the swimming pool and by dragging them out before they drowned, and eventually they all learned how to swim. So there was a lot of really rewarding parts of it as well. You just become very involved with the families.
It's true, and we also see the kids grow up, which is a particular joy to be an aunt or an uncle, to see the kids go through school and achieve and have their accomplishments, and we mark each birthday as best we can. We usually have quite a big blowout party. So there are those benefits. We have all now 4 extra children in our lives, you know, certainly with the Aref family.
You probably didn't expect that when you got into this.
No.
No. But it's wonderful. So there are benefits. It's not all completely grim. If I could, I'd like to read a very brief poem.
Okay.
That Yassine is a poet.
Okay.
He's many, many things. He's an imam. He's quite an educated guy, and he's a superb poet. He sends his poetry regularly now to be put into an enormous database that we made of his poetry. This database expands and expands and expands. It's the biggest database I've ever seen. This poem, I think in particular, relates to what we've been talking about. It's called Soul. As they say, when someone dies, you must open a window to allow his soul to get out and fly back to the sky. I'm wondering, if I die in this prison cell where there is no window, what will happen to my soul? How will it fly? Where will it go? So these are the kinds of things that he thinks about, we think about, his family thinks about, and is the reality for all of these people.
Thank you, Jeanne. Would you want to mention any of the national cases that your organization is following?
Sure. Of course, one of the critical ones is the Samuelarian case. This is where he has essentially been under house arrest for at least 5-6 years now, and has yet to be tried. And it is amazing. We think of house arrest as something that happens to Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma or something, you know, but not here in America. We don't do that. Well, those days are gone. Now all sorts of things are out the window. But he's one of the lucky ones. He hasn't been convicted yet. He's still under house arrest. But some of the people, like the people at the Holy Land Foundation, Hassan Alashi, for example, sent off to prison for 86 years, essentially for building schools and hospitals in Palestine. One of the worst decisions ever made by the courts. It's an absolute abomination. And we know the family very well. It's a wonderful family. One of the cases I think that really impacts all of us is the Fort Dix Five. This was particularly a group of 3 young men who were roofers with their father down in New Jersey. They were married, they had families, and they were convicted of a plot to attack Fort Dix, even though the government agent who testified at the trial acknowledged that they'd never heard of the plot to attack Fort Dix. But even though they never heard of it, they were still convicted, and they were sent off to jail on a life sentence to be served in solitary confinement. Now, if you can imagine the injustice of this, it is really astonishing. Tariq Mahana is another well-known case of a person who basically only said things that he believed were true, and he believed that this was free speech. He said that Muslim countries had the right to defend themselves against foreign invasion, including America. And for that, he was convicted of material support for terrorism and sentenced to jail for, I think it was 20 years, something like that, 22. So these are some of the more famous cases. Of course, the Darfur case I mentioned earlier. But there are literally hundreds of these cases all over the United States, and every few days something else comes up and a new case is presented, and you begin to realize how really manipulative the government was. We've just discovered, for example, that there's a good reason to believe that in Yassine's case, Yassine Araf, in his case, the government actually targeted and convicted the wrong person. They thought he was somebody else. And it turned out now that the person that they thought he was is dead. And so we're going to try to use this as maybe a way to get him out. But of course, once the government does something like this, puts a person in jail, they never admit it. They will never admit it. You have to fight, fight to get somebody out. So,
what are the issues that you're working on now? What are the most important issues to you right now? Briefly.
Yeah. Well, maybe I could add one thing that Project SALAM is working on is a database. Right from the very beginning, we started a database in which we tried to list all of the cases that we thought were preemptive prosecution. And I think we have the best database in the country. Kathy Manley's been working on this, Lynn Jackson, and they've done a terrific job with it. And we're about to come out with a report that will finally be able to put some statistics on what everybody has sort of felt intuitively. The preliminary statistics indicate that of the cases that the government considers terrorism cases, about 90% of those are either preemptively prosecuted or have elements of preemptive prosecution about them. So I think that's going to be an important thing, because it will change, I think, a little bit of the dialogue so that people will recognize how misused this terrorism label is, and will hopefully get people to say, why are they misusing this label? Why are they calling so many different people terrorists? Who's benefiting from that? What is this fear supposed to produce? These are, we have said that we will win this when we have convinced people that they have more to fear from the government than they do from the terrorists.
And I'd like to add one thing. I think that it's very important that perhaps people listening to this show, reading generally the mainstream media reports about terrorism, I would say two words: caveat emptor. Let the reader, in this case, beware, understand that the information that you are getting is, of course, the government's information, because there is no other information available, because these cases have not yet gone to trial, and therefore the other side, namely the defense, has not yet presented its case. And so what you are getting with many of the news stories is one line only. This generates fear. I would say think, wait, read, think. Don't judge, wait, follow the case, and then make up your mind.
Very good. Thank you. And we're going to have to end it there. Jeanne and Steve, I hope you'll come back again and join me again. There's so much more for us to talk about. I wanted to ask you about Guantanamo Bay, and there's so many other questions I have, so I hope you'll return soon. I really appreciate your being here today. Finally, just how would people contact you if they want to get more involved and be part of this?
Websites for Project SALAM, projectsalam.org, website for National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, which is civilfreedoms.org. Very much information, up-to-date coverage of all kinds of issues, particularly NCPCF, that relate to the whole area of preemptive prosecution, Islamophobia, and civil liberties in this country.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you,
Thank
Judy.
you.
Well, we'd love to come back.
Hope you will.
Bring them home, bring them home, bring our parents, our children home, from the dust of Afghanistan back to our arms, bring them home.
Bring them home, bring them home, bring our sons and our daughters home, from the ghettos of Baghdad back to our arms.